Okay, welcome back, lovely crowd at Tech Leader Stage. Our next panel will be the Neuro-Architecture of Productivity, how work environments impact cognitive performance. Please welcome with me on stage Elena Decan, Director for Workplace Design and Consulting at Steelcase, as well as Rudi Bauer, Managing Director at WeAreDevelopers.
Yes, hello and wonderful afternoon from my side. I hope you enjoyed the show so far in the last 1.5 days. I really did. And I'm really happy to have Elena with me now. And I think we are talking about a topic where I'm definitely not the expert, I'm 100% sure. But it's a kind of a hard topic for me because there was a kind of a lot of, and probably we can start with this first, and it's probably my first question. There was this kind of corona, and then we had home office, and before that I was working for a company and we built an amazingly nice office. So yeah. I think it was rebuilt and rebuilt and reconstructed and reconstructed, and it turned nicer and nicer and nicer and nicer. Then we had corona, everybody was moving into the home office.
Empty and empty.
Yeah,
okay.
For sure. And what is needed to make the office the place to be?
So I think there's as many answers probably as organizations out there, so you didn't start with a simple one. I would say if you want to really simplify things, it kind of needs to be better than wherever else you might want to be working, right? Because otherwise, why would you go into a 1-hour traffic jam? For what, right? Why wouldn't you be, we were just talking about Hawaii, right? Why won't you be under that palm tree if that's the better environment for you? And that's why I'm interested in this topic of neuro-architecture, because in the end I think we have a lot of things not in common, right? There's a lot of words here, for example, the last 2 days that I don't understand, right? I'm from different industry. But I think what combines all of us is we all have brains, and the brains are kind of important for the jobs that we are doing. And all our brains are somewhere in the physical space, right? We're here now, and that has an impact on our brains in this very moment. So to go to the office, hopefully the impact on your brain and on your body is better than wherever else you would be.
Question to you in the audience, who of you isn't really an expert in neuro-architectural things? Raise your hands, please, quickly.
Anybody? We can put another chair. We have some space. Yeah?
If no hands are up, I would ask you, Elena, to probably give us a short introduction on the topic of the term, what it means and what's behind it. Because honestly, when I got the information that I have the pleasure to host this panel with you, the first thing what I did, I asked ChatGPT, could you please give me a short introduction on this topic?
Yes, of course. And there's no wonder, right? You didn't miss anything. It's really a pretty new topic, actually. So neuro-architecture, it's somewhat implied in the naming that we're talking about two disciplines that are coming together. We're talking about neuroscience on the one hand, and we're talking about architecture on the other. So both of those disciplines are not new, right? Space existed a while ago. Neuroscience also existed a while ago. But now what's actually interesting is how do these things impact each other, especially now that we're talking so much about where we're working and how are we working. And one thing to make it, I think, quite easy to understand are questions like, why do you think the best parties always happen in the kitchen and not on a long dining table? Or maybe, why do you always want to, knowingly or not, sit with your back to the wall when you're in a restaurant? Why do people believe, or more likely to believe in a God when they step into a church? All of those things are actually quite interesting, and they're far bigger than, do I like this chair? Do I like this space? And I think that's really at the core of neuro-architecture.
Compile it back for me now. Does it mean that when we were talking about architecture and design, it had a lot to do with architecture and design? So make it pretty, make it stylish, make it modern. And now with this kind of approach, we probably take the human deeply into it first. time, probably.
Exactly, yeah, because in the end, it's about human and human behavior, right? Because why are we coming into a space? We're never coming into a space for the sake of it. A chair is nothing without somebody sitting on it. So it's really to put the focus on the human and the human behavior. And I think, why hasn't this been done before? And you can't say that it hasn't, right? Like, we moved through space and we adjusted to our needs. But when you think about architecture, and I'm a designer, I work in space, but a lot of decisions are made in 2D, if you think about it, right? There's a plan or even a fancy rendering, and this is what you judge. You judge how much do I like the shape of this, and you have some Sarah Hadid, you know, and it looks cool, and maybe it also feels cool, but it's really hard to judge if you don't actually have the data of what does impact the human behavior. So decision making is sort of simplified to a two-dimensional space. And I think that's part of the reason, probably not all of it.
And I mean, I'm more into the HR side from my background. I'm more into leadership topics.
Stepstone, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Before I joined WeAreDevelopers, and I'm more into that topic. And there's a lot of discussions going on, but I think it has an impact on your topic as well. We are having this kind of diversity, everything is becoming more and more global, cultural aspects. How could you bring that, or how do you implement that in this neuro-architectural approach? Because I think it's a difference if your background is from Southeast Asia or from North Europe, if you move into an office.
Yeah. That's true, and I think there's different spaces that we can think of, or different forms of culture and identity. So if we're talking about the space of an organization, we kind of have two cultures and two identities meet, right? And there's an overlap. There's a culture of a country, and there's a culture of an organization. And I would say maybe somebody working in Germany for Google is maybe more like somebody working for Google in the US than maybe somebody who's a kindergarten teacher in the village next door. So there's two sides of things. There's a cultural element of the organization, of the company, and then there's the individual diversity. And I'm happy that you say that, actually, because it feels wrong to talk about neuro-architecture without talking about neurodiversity. Obviously, we have different types, and luckily we understand now that the way how our brain structures is just a bit different. I'm very dyslexic, for example, so that means I have a hard time spelling, but three-dimensional thinking is easy to me, and we know that these things matter. And just to answer the question on the culture, what is very important is to understand what are the levels, what is different from one country to another. One thing that usually is changing a bit is not our need for privacy, but how privacy is perceived. So it's very important to work with teams for the organizations where they work for and actually design together. So privacy would be something, representation. For some countries, materiality is extremely important. In the Middle East, for example, you can see by I would say, the surface of the table, probably the status of the person working behind it. Privacy in Amsterdam means a bit something else, right? And having even an own office would not be seen as something representation shaping. So it's very important to look at the organization and deduct what's needed, of course, and then to look at the culture where the team actually lives. So this one-off approach that was done before COVID in many organizations to say we need to have sort of this wrong idea of, I think, equality. Everybody gets the same everywhere, no matter what they do and who they are, is not something that I think is good enough of an approach to be better than your home office. So that's, I think, a critical point.
If a company now starts to think about building probably the optimum office for the organization, honestly, if you have to take care about all these kind of issues and topics and differentiations, can you do it top down? So the managing directors sitting
just decide
together
it for everyone.
how do you start building this?
Yeah. So I think the answer is no, but if you do it without the top, it's probably also going to fail, right? So if it's especially if it's a change management shift, sort of, you say, like, for example, look, we shouldn't all have our own office because it's a crazy waste of real estate because half of you are only here half the time and then the managers have meetings all day. So it's very important that sort of the highest level of the organization is part of it, but it can't be top down because what we're looking at is really, and that maybe doesn't have to be person by person, but you need to know what's the diversity of people that work for you, like how can you pattern that? And what's the diversity of activities that have to be done? Like if you try to focus somewhere, I'm thinking that you would probably prefer a very different space than if you want to have a social interaction with somebody else. And I think to understand sort of, if you want to think of space as a tool, to understand what are you trying to achieve in the organization and by whom, then you need to first look at, of course, what's the task that you want to do. If you want to take a hammer and drill in, light bulb, good luck, right? That's probably not going to work. So you need to know the strategy of the organization. Here, the top level is very important. Do you want to grow? Do you have a problem with siloed thinking, maybe? Do you have a problem with well-being? That's an important one. So we need to know that. And then you need to work basically with the teams. And you don't have to ask them what they want, because they tell you, I want what I have, and I want more of it, right? That's the answer that you're going to get. But what you need to ask is, what are you actually doing? Like, how does your workday look like? What interactions do you have, and with whom? And what's the outcome that you're trying to get to?
What is the best way to collect all the needs? Because I think the needs are a multiply of the number of individuals that you have in a company.
Yeah.
Because everybody has got different needs throughout the day. Yeah. And I found a really nice graphics when I was going through material from a company, and there was one graph which I remember. It was a kind of a two illustrations of a meeting room which could be used for all hands company meetings. And one was the traditional way that we all know. Okay, you have a room and there are chairs, probably not in this order, so probably are messing around somewhere in the room, so everybody can pick and choose his seat. And there was a totally other one where there was a stage and there was some chairs were really aside, and there was even a small wall with flowers in between. How can you collect all the needs?
Yeah, so of course you can't design a single office per person, right? Because you would have a lot of offices then, and then we're back in the home office. So what has proven to work quite well is, of course, to look at the strategy, and then we usually work in a mix of some larger scale surveys, like what are the things that you're missing? For example, a lot of people are missing right now the chance to retreat. And that makes sense, right? Because we have a lot of open offices. And not saying that that's wrong, but if you're trying to do focus work and you have nowhere to retreat, and now going to the neuroscience side of things maybe, like as long as you're sitting, maybe like this, right? If I would be sitting like that, whether I'm conscious of it or not, my subconsciousness would be always on alert mode, because my subconsciousness knows something is happening behind me and I might have to flee. So to be focused then is really, really hard. So we're looking at needs that come up at scale. So we need more need for privacy, or we have a need for collaboration, and so on. We look at the strategic needs and then we combine them into one. And I think it's quite interesting that the way how, for example, a meeting room, because you're talking about all hands, I was thinking instantly about stand-up, which is interesting, right? Because I'm sure most of you had a stand-up meeting in your life, right? Maybe. Why is it called stand-up? Most of you are probably sitting at home on your couch, right? So why is it called stand-up? And the reason behind this is that when you have actually a meeting where you're standing up and you have a small table, meetings are proven to be more dynamic, more democratic, and more effective. So what we collectively, without anybody really thinking about this, decided probably is, I want a collective, fast-paced, and efficient meeting, and let's call it stand-up, right? So this matters. And for example, if we have spaces where we have like big tables with big rows around it, we know that there's less participation. Because imagine you're an intern in an organization and you have a good idea, but you have to ask your managing director to stand up so you can reach the whiteboard, right? Will you do it? Probably not. And so it's hard to judge an area without knowing what it's intended for. But the flexibility and the control are a huge part of making it easier for brains to perform well.
I mean, as this normally takes decisions from the top as well, and it costs money normally to implement this. Is there a kind of result survey studies where you can say there's a direct correlation between neuro-architecture and business results and performance improvements?
Yeah. So there are a lot of studies, and basically all of them show that it has a big effect. But you need to break it down, of course, because it's both an abstract thing, right? What does architecture then mean, and how exactly does it look like, and what is the performance before? So it's somewhat hard to measure. But I remember before we were talking a bit about biophilia, for example. Biophilia, do you know what that means, biophilic design? Yes, no? So
I Googled it as well. So.
you Googled it? Maybe we can make a little test. Like, before we talk about biophilia, I want you to raise your hand in a second if something applies to you, okay? So please just think for like just a second about a space where you feel really well, like where you're calm, your heart rate goes down, your breathing goes down, you're focused, and you just feel good. Could be anywhere. Could be in a basement or on top of a hill. Can you think about that for a moment? And now I would like you to raise your hand and keep it up if something applies to you. So in that space, is there anything green or natural, like maybe a tree or a hill? Okay, is there anything, is there water maybe? Is there a river? Is there anything like that? Do you see the blue sky or any sky at all? Thank you. I think you just helped me show why biophilia is important and what biophilia is. So biophilic design is the study of using natural elements. So it could be a large window, ideally looking into the forest, fresh air, natural light, natural materials, like, for example, real wood, right? It doesn't really happen. There's like this uncanny valley effect, right? If it pretends to be something and then it's not, that doesn't work. So we need a certain sense of authenticity, organic shapes, and all of that is called biophilia. And here, for example, we have some very interesting study results because especially if you look at the neurodiverse spectrum, people have different needs. Some people can focus very well in a loud environment. Some people can focus very well in a silent one. Some people go to Starbucks. Some people need to be alone, right? But when it's about biophilia, it's good for everyone. Everybody, every brain will perform better. ADHD effects go down. Everybody has a better performance. And here, offices that successfully use and leverage biophilia and privacy levels have an 8% increase in performance with 13% increase of well-being reported. That's a lot. And if you look at the medical side of things in healthcare, we have 22% less painkiller need. So I think that's enormous, right? 10% faster recovery, for example. Education, 20% more learning. And look at most of the classrooms, they are sad, right? And these things matter a lot, 20%. Imagine your education time having to be 20% shorter. You could have traveled the world with that 20%. So it's really a big effect. And that's just one example of how space increases productivity.
But does that mean we shouldn't build offices? We probably should have a kind of an outdoor area and a tent there or something like.
It's a good next question, right? Because we all would like that, right? Everybody's fantasy is, can we finally prove that if I just run over a field and be happy, I can work better? And the question is probably, the answer is probably not. And I'm sorry, because I like the outdoors, right? Especially since COVID, everybody got a camper, everybody did yoga. So there's a draw to nature, and I get it. There's technology everywhere, and we want to be close to nature, and we should be. However, if we're talking about the office, of course, it's not just about well-being, right? Well-being would probably shoot up like nothing, but it's also about productivity. And here it's really about finding the balance of where can you feel well and be well, but also be productive. And for example, like having an ergonomic furniture, having access to your colleagues, being able to collaborate, learn from each other, is very hard if you're sitting somewhere in the forest by yourself. And here we see big sort of long-term effects, because individually, your productivity increases when you work wherever you want to for a while, until your back gets painful, right? But your individual productivity might increase, but what gets super hard is to learn from each other, right? Because 90% of the learning happens accidentally in an office. I see you doing something brilliant, and I'm like, let me write that down, or let me ask you that question. So that's something that, that just doesn't happen if you have to plan a call. So that's one thing. And the other thing is innovation. If you think about it, innovation is just combination, no? It's unlikely combination. If you don't make fire with a stick and a stone, probably you're building on something that somebody else did. So to have that closeness to your colleagues, to be able to have power when you need it, have Wi-Fi when you need it, and have your colleague when you need them, does make a big difference.
But what raises up in my mind now, did it need biophilic as a new term? Because honestly, what we're discussing now for me is deep in us as humans. So it's a kind of a feeling, probably a little bit degenerated, or we became a little bit degenerated over time, and we lost this kind of natural way of feeling things. And I mean, there was a trend probably 20 years ago who rushed through Europe. It was Feng Shui. Yeah. Is it similar, or is it totally? Because I mean, the aim was the same, right? It was to get this kind of. I have this kind of personal feelings, and I feel what's in me. So I mean, that was the major aim for me in that trend.
I mean, trends are always as good as their word, right? And usually there are other things that didn't happen now, because if things have huge effects on something, then it's probably not the first time. It's a bit like design thinking, maybe. Like, is design thinking the first idea that invented prototyping? Of course not. But that doesn't mean that prototyping is not important. Yeah. And I see that here a bit. And I think, yes, of course it's not new, right? But the way how the discourse was led, or how decisions were made when we're talking about office spaces, is unfortunately often very efficiency driven. And efficiency makes sense, and effectiveness makes sense, but if you're talking about brains and humans, if you're talking about space, then packing as many people as possible in a box, which is unfortunately the reality of many workspaces, is something that's just not helping us. So I think to have some data and to have language to talk about that, and biophilia is just one thing, it's not everything, right? But activity-based working, diverse spaces, and learning from neuroscience, I think, can really help.
As we're talking a lot of AI on this conference, and I think it's a
I realize that, yeah.
It's a really big topic. And I mean, for me, what I understand from listening to you is that neuro-architecture also means understanding individuals better, and taking care about their individual needs instead of building a one-fits-all kind of office type. How can AI support that? I mean, because at the end of the day, AI knows a lot, and AI can provide a lot of data and results. How can you use that? Is there?
So at the moment, and we're a relatively big company, right? We have multiple offices based also on research, and we are also using AI, and we're testing ways to use AI, because I think probably none of us or none of our organization can afford not to, because it just accelerates the speed so much. So what we're looking at the moment is, how can AI help us to gather and manage huge amount of data better? When I talked about surveys, we're not only looking at offices, also as universities, for example. We have thousands of students. How can we make sure that we really get what we need out of those, out of that data? So here, AI can help us, and also generative space planning. So we're looking at floor plans, for example, and sometimes we work with huge organizations with thousands of employees, and of course you can't talk with everyone, right? So to understand patterns and to understand how, we know that we need privacy and we need nukes to return, and we know that we need flexibility, but how much of it, how many of those small spaces do we need, how many of those biggest? Here AI can really help us, and AI can also really help us with making sense of the data that we get back to prove that the difference is there. So I think it's on those two sides.
And if we're now having this kind of implemented new office with all the kind of possibilities that are there, I mean, there's a limit and a border. What do you think about giving then every single employee the chance to probably make it more his own, so to individualize it on his own needs.
So individualization is something, of course, this comes up a lot, right? Because people are different, and then you have different needs, and maybe you want a picture of your cat, and maybe you enjoy a lot of privacy. So I would say it's very important to be in control. I think all of us have been in places maybe where we felt stuck, where we feel like we can't escape a conversation, we can't move around. So that's really important as a baseline. So control, especially about our privacy level, is really important. On the other hand, we want to be effective as well, right? And we don't want to have huge spaces assigned to you, and then I need a fountain, and then I need this, right? And here I think it's really about balancing what do we need as a we, and what do we need as an I. So I think it's very important as an individual, you can make small adjustments to your space. For example, have more privacy, or for example, rotate to where you sit to the window. Like, for example, for ergonomics, you're supposed to sit like this, right? The window should be here. That's good for your physical health. But then for your brain, it's often not good because that means there's movement behind you. So to give this kind of control to the user, I think is super good. But we shouldn't forget that control can go both sides, right? You can change the space that you're in, or you can, if you have a diversity of spaces, change your position in that space. And I think this is interesting for organizations, right? Because not everybody can, should, or we can't afford to give everyone everything. But we can have like a buffet. We can have enough of everything for everyone depending on their needs. And we need to figure out, now, do we need more salad or more pizza? You get to that with data. So how can we have a space that's diverse enough, fulfilling different needs, and make it accessible to use those different spaces?
I think it was in 1994, 1995, so quite some years ago. I was working for Ericsson, and we had a really beautiful office in Stockholm, and it was built into the coast. So you went in at the top, and then you got 8 floors down with the elevator, and
nice.
every office had a view to the sea.
Yeah.
And what they have done, and I really love this, and I mean it's really many years ago, and it was extremely innovative at this time. We had meeting rooms, small meeting rooms along the line to have view to the sea. And what they did, they took a group of people and they were randomly put together, and this group of people got a budget to really design these meeting rooms.
Okay.
And there was one meeting room, it was in Western style, one was in Asian style, one was, and then I think that's probably not the big innovation, but what they then did, and I really loved this, because everybody brought some flowers there and they made it nice. This team was really responsible for keeping it nice.
Responsibility is important as well. Ownership.
That is what I wanted to ask you. How important is then ownership?
Yeah, I think ownership is super important, because also if you're not owning something, you don't really feel at home there, right? And I think that's also something we can add to the personalization touch, because there's a need also emotionally to fill a space and to make it your own. But maybe it doesn't need to happen on an individual level of my cat, my house, my screen. Maybe that can happen on a team level, where we say we have maybe some pictures of our last trip together, or maybe we have the calendar for the year and all of that. And it's very important, and especially if we have like team zones, which seem to be a good balance between sort of being effective in space and then also in what people need, finding your colleagues. It's not fun if you want to find them over 5 stories, but it's very important to have ownership for the space, to be responsible, to keep it in a certain way. And that will also make it feel more homey over time, right? First you might be annoyed, but then it will be nicer.
Yeah. That, as we have one and a half minutes left, my last question that I have, probably this question from you in the audience, we will see. Otherwise, we of course we will handle that. My last question is, how important is, if we're talking about ownership, to also get this ownership for putting the dishes into the dishwasher?
That's a tricky one. I don't know a single company that has figured that out, and also not us, so we're kind of expert on the matter, right? So again, I think it's important to take collective ownership, and I think in the beginning I was talking about the kitchen, and I think anything kitchen is super important, and We can rethink and innovate, but at the end of the day, we want to go back to the fire, right? We want to go back to the fireside. That's where conversations are better. That's where we're more relaxed. And that's where we should have also, of course, a collective responsibility. Knowing that, the bigger the organization, the harder it is to manage those collective duties, which doesn't mean that you should not again and again get them in. So rituals, discuss rituals with your organization and with your teams, and that can really help.
Okay. Are there any questions from you where we can just hand over the microphone to you? Raise your hand if you want to ask Elena something, which otherwise I think I see we have. Okay,
You have a question?
How would you handle background noise in an open space? Because I feel like with open offices, that's kind of a problem.
Yeah. So noise, we haven't talked too much about environmental factors, but noise is one of the key ones that also really are perceived as being very disruptive. And even more so since COVID, I think we all got used to being able to control the noise level better around us, and we have a higher sensitivity. So here there's usually not one answer. Some people put on big headphones, but honestly, then you go back on all the upsides that the open office had, so that's not so great. So one is, of course, sound-absorbing materials, and also just the layout of the space. So if you have benches like this, you can hang a lot of acoustics, right? But you won't really solve it. So it would be a disruption of the space, also visual. Because fun fact, what you don't see, you hear less. It's our brain just making sense of this. So to break visual barriers. And then the most important thing is if you have the luxury, of course, otherwise you should push for it, to have spaces where you can retreat. Successful rules are if you need more concentration than a medium, you retreat. Or if you're louder than the average, you also retreat. So longer conversations should not happen in the open space. They should happen somewhere else.
I think there's many questions and many things you could probably tell.
I'm back here if somebody has more
questions. If somebody wants to get in
I'd be
contact with
happy.
you, I think LinkedIn is a good way.
Yeah?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for staying with us. I know there's a lot going on.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
That's really nice. Thanks.
Okay, stay tuned. 10 minutes left for responsible AI in practice, real-world examples and challenges.